Today, we acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabeg peoples on whose traditional lands we are meeting. Today provides us with an opportunity to learn and to grow in our understanding of Indigenous history, and this knowledge should change how we think and act going forward. And with that, it truly is my pleasure to welcome our presenter, Darin Wybenga, to the stage.
Miigwech, thank you for the introduction. It's my pleasure to be here. I should say Ani, which is our way of saying hello in Ojibwe. And my understanding from our language teacher is that it means I see your light, and I do see your light. And it's a pleasure, once again, to be here with you. As Jaya said, my name is Darin Wybenga. I'm from the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. I'm a band member there. And one of my jobs is to educate people about the history of the First Nation and the lands that you're situated on. And I do that nowadays. It's mostly been through Zoom or whatever other video format there is. But now it's nice. It's the first time in 2 years I've been able to get out in the treaty lands and territory and talk a little bit. So I'm very glad to be here with you. We've got a lot to cover. I want to cover about 400 years in about 45 minutes. So I'm going to gloss over a lot of stuff. There is some wars and some battles and some really great stuff. Just remember what I'm saying. There's all kinds of little sub-stories behind it, I think all very fascinating and interesting. But we got to try and get the big picture. And today we're in Guelph, so I'm going to focus myself a little bit more on Guelph. So if we look up above me, and I do, oh, there it is. Okay, we can leave it there. Mississauga, the Credit First Nation, you see the slide before, it was an eagle. That was the centerpiece of our logo, and that indicates that at one time, most of the people at the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation were members of the Eagle clan. Now, okay, now you can go ahead. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And so by way of introduction, when you hear the term Mississaugas, you might be inclined to think of Toronto area, you know, Mississauga, Toronto Airport, and so on. But Mississauga is really a name that refers to the Ojibwe people living on the north shore of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. It's not a name we gave ourselves. We called ourselves Anishinaabe, meaning the people or the human beings. Commonly referred to as Ojibwe. We're a subgroup of the Ojibwe people. That's who we are. So when you think about Mississaugas, the Mississauga people, we're strictly Ontario. You'll find us nowhere else as a nation in Canada. This is it. So let's get our story started. We're going to go back to 1634. Next slide, if you will. Wonderful, 1634. Now, it's important to note there's a whole oral tradition that goes before this. I always start at 1634. I start in 1634 because that is when the French explorer Jean Nicolet first encountered us on the north shore of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. Because we don't belong to this area of southern Ontario. You'll notice, this is the lay of the land. 1634, the Mississaugas are up Lake Huron, Georgian Bay, and down below in southern Ontario, you have the Huron-Wendat in the Toronto area. You have in this area, the Guelph region. I don't know how I spelled it up here. I think they're commonly known as the neutral people, but you might have known them as the Chinantan or Atawandaran people. I'll just use neutral for the sake of simplicity. So that's the people, those are the people that occupied the Guelph region, and just north of them are the Tobacco Indians or the Putun. By the way, I'll use the term Indian. Don't you use it, it's not politically correct. I'll use it because, like I said, my mother, my grandparents, all Indians under the Indian Act. Specific government act named for us, Indians, so we don't have a problem. Just, I don't advise you to use it, or use it with care anyway, at the very least. So that's southern Ontario. That's southern Ontario. But there's one more group in our story, and those are the people that you see in the bottom right-hand corner. Those are the Haudenosaunee people. You might know them today as the modern Six Nations people or the Iroquois. And back when this map, for this purposes of this map, they were known as the Five Nations because there's only 5 nations that live in 1634. So these are the main characters of our story, at least the first part of the story. Now, the great thing we had all in common is that we were engaged in the fur trade, big time. We loved European trade goods. We loved the brass kettles. We loved the iron axes. We loved the knives. Think of skinning out a bear with a stone knife. You know, not easy, but a metal knife makes it a lot better. Trying to chop down a tree with a stone lashed to a stick. Hard. Iron axe, a lot easier. So we're all engaged with the fur trade. Now, the people you see up there, the Mississaugas, the Huron-Wendat, the neutral people, the Tobaccos, we all traded with the French. The French were situated in Montreal, Quebec, Trois-Rivières, all engaged in the fur trade, passing beaver pelts up the St. Lawrence. We'd pass them up to the French, they'd come back down to us with the trade goods. Wonderful thing. Now, the Haudenosaunee folks below Lake Ontario, they are trading first with the Dutch because they're in control of New York State, or what becomes New York State at the time, and then the British, once the British take over. Now, they're also engaged in the beaver pelt trade, but they have a problem below Lake Ontario. They quickly exhaust their supply of beaver pelts. They want to stay in the fur trade. Don't blame them. Love those European trade goods. So they have to find a new source of beaver furs, beaver pelts. And so what better place to go than move into southern Ontario and take over that land as a beaver hunting territory. And that is what they do. About 1649, 1650, they move into southern Ontario. And they disperse all those nations that you see there. They disperse the Huron-Wendat. They disperse the Neutrals. All gone. Matter of fact, the Hurons still have a village out in Quebec, still known as Wendake, still from that time period. So Huron are still around. The Neutrals were absorbed into other tribes. They no longer exist as a nation. They cease to be a body, a nation. Anyway, that would have been all well and fine. The Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, they're in the southern Ontario. They're using the land to hunt. But they keep attacking northward into the land of the Mississaugas and our allies. We are allied with other First Nations. We're allied with the Odawa people, the Potawatomi people. I know I don't have them on the map. But they attack northward into the land of our allies. We fight a defensive war against them. You can actually move the next slide if you want to. We fight a defensive war. They attack, we defend, we retreat farther back. They attack, we defend, we retreat farther back. This whole period of time, by the way, is known as the Beaver Wars. Well, you can guess why. By about 1685, the Mississaugas and our allies decided enough was enough. And so about 1685, we think, oral tradition is not exact on this, though it's been verified by European history that this did occur. The nations, Great Lakes nations, counterattack the Haudenosaunee people and drive them out of southern Ontario completely. They go back to their homes in New York State. And you know what? We won't hear from them again until the time of the American Revolution. They're gone. They're below Lake Ontario. But this map here shows, you'll see a rather large, thick red line. That's the path the Mississaugas took, and you'll see, I think you can see it, I don't know if it's bright enough on this map, you'll see the large red line, and it shows our attacking route into southern Ontario. We had our first battle with the Haudenosaunee near Aurelia, very successful battle on our side. And then we split the Mississauga forces off. One group of the Mississaugas went down farther east, and today they still exist. You might be familiar with the First Nations of Scugog, Alderville, Hiawatha, Curve Lake, all in Peterborough area. They drove out the Haudenosaunee at that end of Lake Ontario. My ancestors, from the Mississaugas of the Credit, we drove out the Haudenosaunee at the western end of Lake Ontario. We drove them out with the last battle being at Burlington Bay. And anyway, at the end of the Beaver Wars, we say the end of the Beaver Wars, about 1701, all of southern Ontario became a Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Chippewa homeland. And the Mississaugas, we came at that western end. So if you flip the next map, at the end of the Beaver Wars, this is the land mass that the Mississaugas of the Credit took over at the end of the Beaver Wars. If you look, now hopefully if it's showing up really well, you're seeing a nice yellow, thick yellow line. That's the extent of our territory today that we claim as our territory and our treaty land, and recognized as the government, by the government as such. So our territory stretches from the Rouge River in the east. If you go to the west, all the way to the headwaters of the Thames River, follow the Thames River down, you come to Long Point, and then follow the shoreline, Lake Erie, the Niagara River, and Lake Ontario, all the way around till you come back to the Rouge. That's about 4 million acres of land at the western end of Lake Ontario. You know it as probably better as maybe the Greater Golden Horseshoe area. Probably I say, the most populated and heavily industrialized area in southern Ontario on Mississaugas of the Credit land. So we move into the lands about 1701, and we are not people that establish permanent villages. Unlike the Neutral, unlike the Huron-Wendat, unlike the Haudenosaunee, we don't set up permanent villages on the land that stay in one spot for 20 years. We are hunters and fishers, and we move about the land. The Jesuits used to get rather annoyed with us because they would look for us in one place, they'd stay with us a little while, we'd move on to another space, and then they'd lose track of us when they try and find us again. We were always moving on the land, hunting, fishing, gathering. And we always made our homes on the flats of rivers and creeks flowing into major bodies of water. That was true when we lived in northern Ontario, and it was true when we moved into southern Ontario, only now it was Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. If we were suddenly to be transported back in time, and I've mapped some of these creeks and rivers on the map that were our favorites, if we were suddenly transported back into time, I guess 300 some odd years ago, and you would visit these mouths of the creeks and rivers, you would see our wigwams. They're dome structures that were very portable, that we could pick up and move at a moment's notice and just move about the land, but primarily water people. We liked to fish for sustenance. Then maybe in the spring, after the spring fishery was done, we'd move throughout the land, hunt, gather whatever we need. We lived very lightly on the land. Matter of fact, archaeologically speaking, you will find very little trace of the Mississaugas on the land. We lived so lightly. We did not leave a lot of stuff passing around, laying around after we were moved into an area or out of an area. So you'll see the major rivers. One of those rivers, can you see number 4 up there? Is that visible to you, number 4? That's the Credit River. We called it the Missinaihi, and that's how, I'll tell you how we got our name, the Mississaugas of the Credit. The French established a trading post by that river about 1722. And sometimes the Mississaugas, we like to trade in the spring, we would need a trade good outside of spring, say maybe winter or fall. And so we would go to the trader outside of the trading season and say, listen, we need that copper kettle or that iron axe. Can we have it? And the trader would say, yes. take it, but promise you will pay us back when you get the next catch of furs in the spring. And we said yes. The fur trader extended us credit. The Mississaugas becomes known as the Credit River, and we become known as the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that's how we get the name today. There's also an oral tradition among our people that we were also the good credit Indians, that if one of our fellow band members could not pay back the trader, one of the other band members would step in with the pelts and pay the trader off, so we were known as a good risk. You could extend credit to us and be relatively, fairly well assured that you would get paid back in the day. So that's how we get the name. If you flip over the next slide. Oh, wonderful. Did you already do that? Oh, no, okay, I thought you were psychic or something. And so if you look, there's a picture of the Mississaugas or the Credit River on the left. And on the right is a rather romanticized picture of one of our encampments. I can guarantee you it was not so neat. Okay, it was not so neat. We lived lightly on the land and we didn't leave a lot lying around, but our campsites weren't exactly the neatest things. It's a very romanticized picture. But you can get the portability of our wigwams, that we could just pick them up and move them along, according to the seasons. A very seasonally migrant people. So it stays that way. Seasonally migrant people for about 80 years. And then things start to change for our people. A time of relative prosperity for us. There's a few blips along the way, but for our people, we traded with the French. When the French were conquered by the British, 1759, or is it 1760? Isn't that awful? I can't remember. 1759, 1760, Plains of Abraham, all that interesting stuff. We start trading with the British. Okay, and that starts a new period in our history. And now we're going to go, I call it the treaty making period, or the age of treaty making. I think you can move it forward. Wonderful, age of treaty making. Treaties, they're not terribly hard to define. They're just simply negotiated agreements between nations, and usually they're memorialized in some way, whether they're written down or, long before the settlers came, First Nations used to engage in treaty making amongst themselves. We used to memorialize our treaties in wampum belts. And you can see a wampum belt on the bottom left. That's the Ojibwe-Iroquois friendship belt. When we weren't busy killing each other, sometimes it was useful to make friends and peace, and that wampum belt symbolizes that. You'll notice there's two squares at either end, one for the Ojibwe or the Anishinaabe, another for the Haudenosaunee, and there's a straight path of friendship between the two. Well, that's how we used to do our treaties before the settlers came. Once the settlers came, especially the British, we started writing down treaties because it became much more complex. We just couldn't put the terms, weave them into our wampum belts. And that, what you see on the right-hand side of that slide is a treaty from one of our Brant Tract treaties, and you'll see the signatures of our dotems, of our chiefs there. Those are the little animal figures you see there. That's what our chiefs used to sign on the agreement to indicate that they gave assent to the treaty. Not only that they gave assent, but the people under their dotem also gave assent to the treaty. Next slide. So one of the very important slides, not important slides, well, it is an important slide too, but one of the important treaties we have is this, the Niagara Treaty of 1764. The British met with First Nations at Niagara and set out the rules on how to acquire land from First Nations. Like, there was going to be no warfare to conquer land with the British. It was going to all come through negotiation. And so they guaranteed that. And they gave us a wampum belt to symbolize that. And this is called it's often called the Silver Covenant Chain of Friendship belt, wampum belt of friendship, whatever you want to. In our First Nation, we call it the 1764 Treaty Belt. Nothing flowery there with that, just very straightforward. You notice into the belt, it weaves the date. The date is woven right into it, 1764. And you'll notice there's two figures. One figure represents the First Nations. And at this particular meeting, there was 24 First Nations, including the Mississaugas. We're all gathering at Niagara, meeting with the British representative, Sir William Johnson. He hands us his belt, and this belt signifies that we're both living together on the land. One figure represents the Indigenous person, that's the person on the left, and the person on the right signifies the crown, the British crown. They're both holding hands, signifying we're allies and friends. Allies and friends. That's what it's meant to signify, and we take that literally to heart. Bit of a joke here in First Nations country, especially New Credit. And the joke is, well, how do you tell the British figure from the First Nations figure? And we kind of say, well, you can tell the British figure because he has a black heart. He's the one on the right. That's kind of our joke. We laugh at it, but it's kind of true in a way, because now I'm going to discuss treaty making a bit with you, and it's not what the British used to say, beer and Skittles. It's not that. It's not always very friendly, not from our perspective anyway. Next slide. This, once again, is another map of our treaty lands and territory. The large, thick black line you'll see going around represents our territory. But you'll notice our territory is covered by all these wonderful little colorful splotches here. And each one of those colorful splotches represents a different treaty we reached with the Crown. Altogether, the Mississaugas of the Credit have 8 treaties with the Crown, 8 of them. I'll remind you, they're legally binding today, still to this day. This is why you live on the land you live, because title came from the First Nations, negotiated with the First Nations by the British Crown. So I know you're going to want to hear about Guelph, and we'll get to it in a second, but the very first treaty, next line, is born out of the American Revolution. You know all about the American Revolution. I hope you do anyway. Hope you had a great history teacher. Loved teaching about this stuff. You know the American colonies, there were 13 of them along the eastern seaboard of the United States, of what becomes the United States. They'd been on the eastern seaboard for a long time, and they decide they want to throw off King George III's yoke. They're getting tired of taking orders from across the pond in Britain and having to listen to it. So they want to throw off the yoke of King George, and they launch this whole thing called the American Revolution. Well, it was a bad thing if you wanted to stay loyal to King George, because the patriots, as they were called back in that day, could do nasty things to you, tar and feather you, ride you out of town on a rail, throw you in jail, confiscate your property, you name it. Bad things could happen if you wanted to be a loyalist. But if you could make your way up past Lake Ontario, up past Lake Erie, or maybe in one of the maritime provinces, the British Crown would reward you for your loyalty. They would award you land, farming implements, all kinds of things. But that places a tremendous pressure on the British Crown to acquire land for all these loyalists. And so the very first treaty is born actually in the middle of the Revolution, 1781. Next slide. Wonderful. It's our treaty at Niagara. It's for a strip of land 6 miles on the west bank of the Niagara River, 4 miles wide, 6 kilometers wide on the west bank of the Niagara River. The British want it as a safe passage around Niagara Falls, and they also want to use it for farmland to feed British troops farther to the west, places like Michilimackinac, Detroit, and all those places. So they come to my ancestors in 1781 and ask for that land. And we say, yes, not an issue. It wasn't even much discussion about it. The man that made the deal, Sir Guy Johnson, he goes away and he's joking with his friends. And he says to his friends after the deal is made, "You'll never guess what I paid for that tract of land. I paid 300 British coats." You know, the nice red coats that they used to have. We liked red things. So 300 British coats, and they got done. He said to his friends, I really didn't pay that much for the land because I was going to give them those coats anyway for being loyal during the conflict with the rebels. So he thought he was pulling a fast one on us, and I say he probably was, but for us, it meant that the Crown recognized us as the rightful stewards, occupiers, if you will. I hesitate to use the word ownership, but as the rightful occupants of the lands at the western end of Lake Ontario. And I say that to point out to you, too, that we are the only treaty holders recognized by the Crown, even to this day, at the western end of Lake Ontario. So, next line. Nope, not line, slide. Wonderful. This is what we call our Between the Lakes Treaty, number 3, directly born out of the American Revolution. And it's for some very special loyalists. And this is your treaty. You're here today because way back in 1784, 4 of my chiefs and a few representatives from the British Crown signed a deal for this tract of land. We'll talk about the deal in a little bit, what we thought the deal was. But a deal was signed, and that was to enable a very special set of loyalists. Remember those Haudenosaunee people we drove out way back in 1701 and said, don't come back, this is now the land of the Anishinaabe people? Well, they had fought for the British Crown during the American Revolution, and they had lost their homes in New York State. So they needed a place to relocate after the war, because the British made no provision for them in the peace treaty. And so they approached the governor of the day, Sir Frederick Haldimand, and asked if they could have a tract of land. And Frederick Haldimand said, yes, but first I will have to make a treaty with the Mississaugas so we can relocate you there. So Frederick Haldimand made a treaty with my people and then awarded a tract of land. Can you see the black strip going up through the land? That's called the Haldimand Deed, or the Haldimand Tract, or the Haldimand Grant lands. And that was awarded to the Haudenosaunee people. You might have heard of Joseph Brant, the Mohawk war chief. He brought his followers after the American Revolution to occupy that land, and they are still there to this day. You know them now as the Six Nations of the Grand Reserve. They're very much in the news for various activities along the Grand River. But that is how the Haudenosaunee people return back to southern Ontario, all because of a treaty signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Now, I hesitate to use, next line. Slide, pardon me. So if you look at this slide, this is just another bit of a, another map showing where the city of Guelph is located. And notice it's right in the purple blotch there, and that's the Treaty 3 lands. You're right in it there. So make no mistake, Treaty 3 people. So if anybody ever asks you which treaty you belong to, it's Between the Lakes Treaty, number 3, negotiated in 1784, ratified in 1792. So now you know. Good. So I hesitate to use the word ownership when it comes to land. First Nations people don't have a concept, at least back then, we did not have a concept of land ownership. You know, how do you own the land? It's not so much that we own land or that the land belongs to us. It's rather we belong to the land is the way we look at things. It's not a matter of ownership. We occupy it. We exercise stewardship over it. We share the land. We have no concept like the Europeans do of, okay, this is my land now. I own it lock, stock, and barrel. I can do with it what I want, as long as you're not breaking the law, of course. That's true today. You can do pretty much what you want with your own property. But for us, we were used to sharing the land. Did we go to the, you can go to the next slide if you would like to, please. We believed in sharing the land. We negotiated the treaties not on the basis of ownership, but on the basis of land use, shared land use. We knew the settlers were coming. We knew they would establish farms. We knew they would establish villages. But we also knew, or thought we knew, that we would be able to move about the land as we'd always done. In my case, my ancestors fishing, hunting, gathering. We would be able to move about as we always had done. But for the British, if you look on the left-hand side, the Crown, for the British, it was a land purchase. They were buying this land. And you can look at any of our treaties, they're all online, Government of Canada website. And if you look at one of our treaties, any one of them, read them. There's a land description. The land description is basic, this is it. Move from point A to point B, 20 kilometers, move west, 30 kilometers, go south. It's the boundaries for the land. That's all it is. You know, that's all there is. And there's usually some form of compensation for it. In the case of the land where you're situated now, the British Crown paid £1,100 for the land that you now reside on. Okay. And this is what it is for the Mississauga people and other Indigenous people that have signed treaties. You know, it's an agreement to share the land. Like I said, no concept of land ownership. You can look at any of our treaties. You will not see a talk on our treaties about rights. The treaties do not give us rights. We have inherent rights, the rights that the Creator gave us. We've never signed those away with the treaties. We still have a right to harvest. We still have a right to hunt, fish, gather. We still have the right to be sustained by our lands. We never gave those up in any of those treaties. Those inherent rights, we argue, are still in effect to this very day. Unfortunately, you know, it's the 21st century. I don't know what it means for the 21st century. Who knows what sustaining ourselves looks like in the 21st century if we have to sustain ourselves off our lands and our resources. But anyway, no meeting of the minds. The British thought one thing, we thought another. Next slide, please. And the great example for this is Toronto. You want a big joke on all sides, I think, sometimes, but maybe not. Toronto. Matter of fact, you can even advance the next slide. Most people don't realize Toronto was negotiated over twice. Once in 1787, and you know what? In 1787, none of us could agree what the terms of the treaty were. My people said the land boundaries are situated between the Don River and the Humber River. The British said, we think the boundaries of the Toronto Treaty are between the Etobicoke Creek and Ashbridges Bay, so a larger extent. And so in 1788, the government sent out a surveyor and told him to survey the lands, and we stopped the surveyor and we said, listen, this is the boundaries that you should be surveying, not what you want to survey. Anyway, so the surveyor went back and everybody was unhappy because of that. So the British realized a few years later, listen, we entered into treaty and we don't know what we've purchased, so let's dig out the deed. So they dig out the deed about 1794 for the first Toronto purchase, and lo and behold, the deed is blank. There's no land description on it. And you know the dotems of my chiefs, they were glued on from another piece of paper. So kind of, you know, it's a shifty real estate deal. It's kind of funny, but maybe not. And they realized, to their embarrassment, we don't have clear title to the lands around Toronto. And for heaven's sake, the capital, York, is situated on these lands, so we got to figure this out. And so they come back to my people in 1805 and renegotiate another deal. And that time, they took Toronto Island from us. We didn't agree to that, by the way, but they took it anyway. Toronto Island from us, and If you look on the left, the right-hand side, that's the present boundaries of the Toronto Purchase. And they include Toronto Island in that. You'll never guess what they paid. That's about 250,000 acres of land. 10 shillings. If I remember correctly, the equivalent of $60 today. So in 1986, we launched a claim against the federal government saying, listen, you guys took Toronto Island and you only paid us 10 shillings. Like, that's not fair. The government agreed. 2010, we settled a land claim. I don't know how many prime ministers we went through, how many ministers of Indian Affairs we went through, how many crown negotiators we went through. Went through a lot. But while Stephen Harper was prime minister, the claim was settled in 2000. Largest land claim in Canadian history, $145 million. For, like I said, one of the most heavily populated and industrialized areas in Canada. But nevertheless, at least it was settled. But once again, no meeting of the minds. Nobody really agreed with what was going on in the deal. So skip. Oh, what are we? Okay, and so this is our Adjutant's Treaty. Matter of fact, that's the Adjutant's Treaty. That's another big chunk of land just beside Toronto. And you can skip to the next one, I believe, as well. Those are the last of our lands. Because remember I said we had no concept of land ownership. We were sharing, well, the Loyalists come in and they flood our lands. They deplete the game, they deplete the fish. We try and hunt and gather and fish as we always did, but we find plowed fields. We find fences. We weren't able, our traditional economy collapses. We can't keep body and soul together. Our people are sickly. The settlers, the Loyalists bring with them diseases that we didn't know what to do with. We don't know how to deal with smallpox or measles or tuberculosis. We have no medicines that will cure that. So our population starts to decline a lot. When we started the treaty-making process, there were 500 Mississaugas of the Credit band members moving throughout our territory. 10 years into the treaty-making process, mid-1790s, we're down to 400. By the time the Second Toronto Purchase is negotiated, it's 1805. We're down to 300. You can see where this is starting to go. By the time the Adjutant's Purchase and these little fisheries are negotiated, treaties are negotiated, 1820, we're down to slightly less than 200 of us. Matter of fact, those last treaties we sign are, I say, like a gun to our head. Maybe that's a bit too dramatic, but we were on the brink of starvation. We were relying on the government to give us presents. They gave us presents to keep us as allies in case the Americans ever wanted to attack. We'd be a viable military force against the enemies of the Crown. So we were relying on government presence and what little we could get together on the land. And so Colonel Claus, the negotiator in 1818 for the Adjutant's Purchase, came to us and said, I see your women are thin and miserable. Your women and children are thin and miserable. Why don't you give your land into the hands of the Great Father, and we will look after it for you. And we will give you enough to clothe your women and your children. And so Chief Adjutants, that's who the treaty's named after, agreed, because he couldn't do anything. He couldn't watch his people starve. His people die off. He was saying that. And so we agreed, and the final treaties were negotiated. So it was kind of like, yes, we'll get food supplies. I think the term in the treaties is maintenance. maintenance. We will maintain you and give you religious education in exchange for your lands, and you will not want for anything again. Well, so we signed those final treaties, but we at that time thought we were going to be extinct. The Crown thought we were going to be extinct, and we said, yes, we will give it over to the hands of our Great Father because we will not be around much longer to enjoy it anyway. So by that time, 1820 is our last treaty, Treaty 23. All we had left when the treaty-making process was done was 200 acres of land. So in the span of 40 years, 1781 to 1820, 39 years, we went from 4 million acres of land and being independent people that could take care of themselves to 200 acres of land relying on government handouts to keep body and soul together. And like I said, we thought we were going to be extinct. But fortunately, one of our band members came to our rescue. Next slide. I'm getting behind. I usually don't talk with my papers in front of me, but since I have to keep looking around, oh, keep going. By the way, that red spot by the river, Credit River, is our last 200 acres. That's all that remained of our 4 million. All that remained of our 4 million. But fortunately, this man, there he is, the Reverend Peter Jones, he's one of our own band members, came to our rescue. And I love this man because he has great lineage. It's kind of a naughty lineage too, but that's okay. Peter Jones, I won't even try and pronounce his Ojibwe name because I just, if I think about it, I can't pronounce it. That's one of those type of words, you know. His name means sacred feathers in English anyway. Anyway, Peter was born to a Welshman, Augustus Jones, the deputy provincial surveyor, and Tuba Benonakwe, I can pronounce her name, a Mississauga of the Credit woman. So Augustus, the father, was already married. He had a wife living in Paris, but when he's out surveying the land, sometimes he likes a little feminine company. And out of that dalliance came 2 sons, John and Peter. And this is the younger Peter. And so he was not interested in raising his sons. He went back to his wife. He left the 2 boys to be raised by Tuba Benonakwe and her mother's people. And so they grew up learning everything they needed to know about being good First Nations boys. They knew how to hunt and fish, such as it was in the 1800s, you know, not kind of meager pickings on the land. They learned that. They knew the cultural norms, the mores, they knew the legends, the stories. They knew everything, and they were good Indian boys. But for some reason, about 1816, Augustus decides that he wants to give his boys a settler education. So he enters their lives again. He takes them from their mother's people. I don't mean take in a mean way. He moves them away from his mother's people and causes them to go live with him near Stony Creek at this point in time. And there they get a settler education. They learn reading, writing, arithmetic. They learn settler jobs. John, the older boy, learns how to become a surveyor, and Peter becomes a brickmaker. Not exactly the most robust job for a good Indian boy. But nevertheless, he gets a little older, about 1823, and one day Peter decides to go to a camp meeting near Ancaster, Ontario. A camp meeting is just a religious revival put on by the Methodists. And Peter decides he wants the good religion, as we call it, the good religion. He becomes a converted Christian, a Methodist. And he decides the way to save his people is to convert them to Methodism. He's about, 21 now. He wants to convert his people to Methodism and then give them a settler education, reading, writing, arithmetic, and teach them how to farm. And in that way, we'll be on a level playing field with the settlers and we won't be taken advantage of. And you know, by 1825, he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Most of the Credit River band, say maybe 2 or 3 families convert to Methodism, and we're really strong Methodists. We realized the old ways were not working for us. Remember, brink of extinction, starvation, all that stuff. We knew we had to transition somehow, and so we did. We take to Methodism, and we take to adopting to this new lifestyle that resembles a life much more akin to the settlers. So we, with the help of the government of Upper Canada, we move into a mission. A mission village is built on the Credit River. Oh, wonderful, you already done that too. I didn't tell you to move that, did I? See, you're psychic, that's good. We move into a mission village at the River Credit in 1826, and there is a transformation in our lives. Those are 2 contemporary pictures of our village. Notice we're not in wigwams. Immediately before this, we moved from our wigwams right into these 20 homes, log-style homes that the government constructed for us. We quickly get down to work and we build 20 more. We build a hospital. We build a grist mill. We build a sawmill. Complete transformation of our lives. Next slide, please. Complete transformation of our lives. We turn away from the traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering, and we become farmers, and we're very, very good at it. We learn how to farm. We're not planting the Indian crops of corn, beans, and squash. No, we go for oats, wheat, barley. That's what we do. We quickly clear 900 acres, plant those crops. We learn all about animal husbandry. Before, the only domestic animal we had was the dog. Man's best friend was our best friend. We liked dogs. We had the dog. We learn about cows and pigs and chickens and sheep. Trivia question, if you're ever asked a trivia night. What was the first domestic animal held by the Mississaugas, I should say farm animal, owned by the Mississaugas of the Credit? It was the lowly chicken. Mrs. Crane, Chief Crane, his wife, decided that she wanted to emulate the settlers, and she noticed that the settler women raised chickens and sold the eggs and sold the chickens, and she wanted to emulate them. And so she started raising chickens, so that's our first domestic farm animal, I guess you would say. So chickens. We learned about farming, as I said. We were strong believers even today in education. We're good Christian Methodists. Well, how do you become good Christians? You have to know how to read the Bible, to read the good word. And so we learned, we read, and we were fairly literate people long before our settler neighbors were, because we always had a missionary to teach us in our village. And so we were very literate, and very touching story about one of the boys from our mission school died about, I think it was 1828. And we were so enthused with this thing called learning that when he died, they put him in his coffin, and all the other Indian boys and girls brought his school books and laid them on top of his coffin before he buried him, because we were so thrilled to learn these new things. Anyway. So we learn education, deeply religious. We're Methodists were very sober-minded people. Well, so were we, you know. We were not a lot of laughs. Very serious-minded after that. We become businessmen. As I said, we built a grist mill, we built a sawmill. We become the shareholders of the Credit River Harbor Company, and we actually build, using our own funds, 2 piers out into Lake Ontario so that we can ship and receive goods. We build a schooner from our own funds, the Credit Chief, so that we can ship wood around the lower lakes. Most people don't realize that we were doing this. We really learned a lot. We only stayed at the mission village for 21 years because we have a problem. It's a problem First Nations face today. We were facing, of course, settler encroachment, because if you're at the Credit River, where Mississauga, the city of Mississauga is now, You're on a prime piece of real estate. Everybody wanted to move on that prime piece of real estate. So we faced settler encroachment. And the other thing is, we didn't have title to our lands, and that's something First Nations people don't get today. We don't get title to my lands. I live on the Mississauga, the Credit First Nation Reserve outside Hagersville, Ontario. I don't have title to my land. I get a certificate of possession that basically says the government lets me live on this land. Well, that was a problem back in 1847. We couldn't get title to our lands. We knew the settlers were coming. And we always lived in fear that one day the government would put our lands up for sale. Because there was precedent for that in the case of the Coldwater Reserve and the Nawash Reserve. You can look at that. But so we lived in fear that one day the government is going to put up our lands on the reserve up for sale and we're going to lose them. And so it happened. 1847, our lands go up for sale. Uh-oh, what are we going to do? We don't have our village. We've cleared the fields. We've done all kinds of wonderful things. We got to move. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, we're at a loss until somebody comes to our rescue. Remember those Haudenosaunee people we drove out in 1701 and said, get out and don't come back? And then we signed Treaty Number 3 that allowed them to come back in 1784. Well, they heard about our plight. They heard about our lands being sold. And they said, we remember what you did for us after the revolution. So we want to return the favor to you. And so they offered us a tract of land on their reserve lands. Next slide. There it is. And so in 1847, May of 1847, we made the trek from Mississauga, where present-day Mississauga is, all the way down to Hagersville, Ontario, which is a half hour south of Hamilton. That's our reserve. It's a 6,000-acre tract of land, 4,800 acres. Hang on, let me do my math here. Yeah, 4,800 acres in Brant County, 1,200 in Haldimand County. We straddle two counties. And our reserve extends right into the middle of Hagersville, Ontario. So we're really, really closely associated with the town of Hagersville. About 250 of us move into the area, and we immediately take up farming. And we do quite well at it. But there's a problem with all this. The problem, well, at least for us, remember I told you before, we always camped on the flats of rivers and creeks flowing into major bodies of water. We come to New Credit, and we have two small creeks flowing through our lands. They dry up in the summer. Like, you're not going to float a schooner. You're not going to have a harbor company. You're not going to have sawmills and grist mills, but at least we can farm. But even then, things start to turn sour with the farming because you have 6,000 acres of land, you have 250 band members, wait one generation, so let's talk about 1867, about the time of Canada's Confederation. Now you have to split your land up because you got kids. They want land. And so that 6,000 acres has to be split up. So the family farm begins to shrink a little bit. Stay another generation, so think about 1888, 87, somewhere in there. Got to split it again because you got another generation of kids. So the family farm no longer supports a family. It becomes so small. So that's a problem. So agriculture, the wheels are starting to fall off. There's also another problem. There's always new equipment in agriculture, always new farming techniques, whether it's a new combine or threshing machine or something. Well, the settlers, if a new equipment comes out, can go to a bank, put their land up for collateral, and get a mortgage out and buy the new equipment. But remember what I said, First Nations people can't put their land up as collateral at a bank because First Nations land is only meant for First Nations people and the bank can't foreclose on it. So, anyway, we can't get loans from the bank, so we fall far behind in agriculture. And so while we were extremely good in it, we couldn't keep up with the rest of the world outside the boundaries of the reserve. And we really only get a good thing. We get a bit of a start with agriculture again, and I say a bit, because of World War I. When World War I broke out, there was, how'd that go, to about 238, we'll say still about 250 band members. We sent 11% of our people off to fight in World War I. And I don't want to say a good thing came out of World War I, but it kind of does, because, you know, we all know World War I was just brutish. But for us, the men that came back could take out soldier settlement loans, and then we could get that farm equipment and stuff. So it gave us a bit of a leg up for a short time, but only a short time. So in a way, World War I did have some benefits for us, but I don't want that to overshadow the misery that it truly was. So that necessitates another transformation of our people. We realize we can't farm anymore, so we have to go elsewhere to the nearby communities, whether it's Hamilton, Simcoe, Brantford, and we work in light industry. And that's a problem that we have today. Even today we face that even though our population is fairly well educated, we have to go elsewhere to practice whatever we want, whatever we learned as a trade. Myself, I never taught on the reserve school. I always taught elsewhere, and I did so for 20 years. My boss at the Department of Consultation where I work, his brother is Mr. Justice Harry Laforme of the Appellate Court of Ontario. He had to go practice law elsewhere, makes his way as a judge. We have a medical researcher, Dr. Malcolm King with the World Health Organization. I think he's just recently retired. But we face a brain drain at New Credit even to this very day that our people get educated and off they must go elsewhere to keep body and soul together. But we transform ourselves, and I'm always very grateful that we're always transitioning. We don't stand still. So next slide, please. These are some of our more modern buildings at New Credit. We've come a long way from wigwams in a few hundred years. Fairly modern buildings. We have a solar energy company. We have a business development corporation. We're always looking out for new ways to develop things and look out for our people. One of the most exciting things that went on, for example, was, maybe you don't know because you're at Guelph, you're not Toronto, but Sidewalk Labs, a subsidiary of Google, was going to modernize part of the Toronto waterfront, and I like to say Googleize the waterfront, build apartments and stores and do everything and make it a showcase computerized city, at least a couple blocks of Toronto anyway. And we were involved with that because as treaty holders, we have a right to be consulted and to take part in some of these things. And so we were involved in Sidewalk Labs. So we're always looking for ways to improve ourselves. The Sidewalk Labs deal fell through between Toronto and Google. But we're still involved, still on the Toronto waterfront, working on developments that we can be involved in. Now, I know time is growing short. I don't want to say too much. The treaty, skip to, just one. Oh, one, back one, there we go. Treaty making process, in a way, is still going on. If you look on this treaty map, this is our 8 treaties. If you look up at our eastern boundary, you'll notice there's a little square blotch of land without color. That's the Rouge Tract, part of our territory, but that we never signed a treaty over that. And so I'm very glad, and I have it on very good source, very reliable sources, that we're about to negotiate that agreement for that tract of land now, because it's home to Rouge Urban National Park, of all things. So it's good to clean up title to land. So that's one. Next slide. The next claim we have with the Crown is our water claim. Unextinguished Aboriginal title to all the water groundwater, aquifers, reservoirs, floodplains on our treaty lands because none of our treaties spoke to water, except one, and that was because the British wanted to throw a bridge over the Credit River. So they signed a treaty and mentioned water in one of our treaties. All the rest were silent about the waters. And so now we've just recently entered into, well, not entered, we submitted a claim to the Crown in 2016, so something ongoing. We asked our people, what do we want to achieve from the water claim? Greedy individual that I am, I said, well, we must get money. I'm glad to say that's not the sentiment of the rest of my people because I always tend to think with that. They said, you know what, we want our spiritual and cultural connection back to water again. That's what we want out of that treaty, so however you can make that work, they told my committee. We also want to exercise our right to stewardship over the waters. In the spirit of the treaties, we still want that. We still want to share the lands, the resource, the waters, and we want to make sure that it's good for everybody, everyone, settlers, for ourselves. If water is the lifeblood of Mother Earth, we have the responsibility to look after it for everyone. So we want that. And so we'll see where that goes, where that treaty goes, if it goes, because remember, we might say we have a grievance against the Crown, but the Crown is ultimately the one that says whether they will negotiate or not. And if they say they don't want to negotiate, apart from going to court itself, it's a no-go. So, something to think about. Last thing I want to talk to you, because like I said, time is really getting short, and as always, I talk a lot. I want to talk, because whenever I do these things, whether it's on Zoom or now I'm out here, people ask about reconciliation. Always, that's the word, it's the big word, especially in the light of the residential school graves, and you hear about issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women, all that rather troubling stuff. So we hear a lot of talk about reconciliation, and you'll hear maybe that there's 94 calls to truth and reconciliation, all that sort of stuff. People ask me, what does reconciliation mean? And I say, you know what, I don't know. I know there's a reality, there's two peoples. I know there's the settler folks, and I know there's First Nation folks, and we each had our way of doing things, and I think back to that original treaty that we're both on the land, friends and allies. I know that, I think back to that, and I think, what is reconciliation? And I don't know. I don't know what it means. I don't know how it's going to develop, but I know it's going to develop. Hopefully, naturally. It's going to occur naturally. And I love the two-row wampum belt for this. It's not a belt that comes from the Mississaugas. It's actually a Haudenosaunee belt. And you notice there's two purple stripes in this wampum belt running parallel to each other. This was actually a treaty first with the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee, but many of the Great Lakes tribes, including us, have adopted it. So one of those purple stripes, anyway, represents an Indigenous canoe. The other represents a settler ship. And we're both going down the river in parallel. Now, if you remember back to math class, if things are in parallel, they run together side by side and they don't interfere, they don't run into each other. That was the original intent of that treaty. Sorry, we've run into each other a lot. Not always with good consequences on both sides. But I love, it might be hard to see on the screen, but separating those two purple stripes are beads, a strip of white beads, with three beads in width. Each one of those beads, the three of them, peace, respect, and friendship. Now, if we can walk together on the path of reconciliation, think of it as a road, and walk in peace, respect, and friendship, reconciliation will take place. Because on the road, you talk to each other. You get to know each other. There's some back and forth, there's some banter. Pretty soon you're telling about each other's families and your hopes and your dreams and your aspirations. And when you come to understand each other, the path won't be that difficult. It takes both sides. It takes the First Nation side to do it, and also takes the settler side. We both have to walk that same path and treat each other with peace, respect, and friendship. And then everything else will develop out of that. That's the way I look at it. I don't know what the path to reconciliation holds. I really don't. But I know it will come, and if we can work together that way and not see each other as two opposing sides. But remember those two figures clasping hands in that first wampum belt? Let's look towards something like that. Let's keep that first and foremost in our minds, and hopefully things will come together. I'm going to leave it there for now. I know I've covered lots of stuff. I left out the War of 1812, I left out Pontiac's Rebellion, I left out all kinds of things. But remember what I said, there's all kinds of stories behind all of these stories. So go to your library, go wherever you go to research these things. You got the University of Guelph here, so what better place to go than look at stuff? Look online, look at Library and Archives Canada. Lots of material there. And literally think about it. It's not enough just that you hear, but that you do, that you put into practice what you've learned. So anyway, that's it. I see you're coming and you haven't got the hook or anything to drag me off stage, so